Okay, any other logistical questions? Okay, so let's do a quick review of last Monday's class, and then let's delve into an exercise and then talk about today's content. So you remember this agenda, right? I mean, this is again our framework. We're moving on, and on Monday we talked about these, overarching today's issues on technical applications as we move into the applications. So today we will be talking about infrastructure, telecenters, and agriculture, and for the next couple of weeks we will be drilling down on the different sectors of ICTD. On the trend side of things, and this is interesting because, during the ICTD 1.0, and I'm sorry, Eric, can I ask you to do the door? Just keep it ajar because it's usually so loud, I bother, and they usually have a faculty meeting there, So, during the ICTD 1.0, when I was first in the industry, the buzzwords were, leapfrogging and access and digital divide. And so those were a lot of what was happening then, and there was a lot of literature surrounding that. Today, some of the buzzwords and the trends are these things, right? Bottom of the pyramid, still digital divide somewhat, a lot on rights-based approach, internet as a human rights, which was an assigned reading, lots of discussion on innovation, appropriate technology, particularly mobile, and then as we move into more of an open sort of culture, it's open everything with the type of big data and big everything that we're talking about. So what we did in our last class was we zoomed into 4 of these concepts that were kind of what I've seen in a lot of, in industry, a lot more presence within the proposals, or at least the request for proposals. So on the ICTD policy side, one of the things is ICTD policies, which is a brand new area because we need to talk about security, privacy, etc. Things that the iSchool and together with the law school offers courses on. So on the ICTD side, the supplementary reading, which is the ICT policy handbook, that one gives you sort of the whole contextual kitchen sink on the broad categories of ICTD that you would want to, that are prevalent in ICTD policy these days. And then in ICTD practice, what we have learned from the paper is that at the end of the day, it's still a very chaotic process. It's not that different than policy of other kinds of sectors. It's also not that different from international development projects in general. So a lot of the groundwork needs to be set in place. We have a lot of model laws, model policies that you can download in this day and time, cybersecurity, etc. But it is the same old foundational factors of buy-in, stakeholder management, communications, things that were talked about in Kintaro's and Ishare's article, right? And then we moved on to the bottom of the pyramid, and we found that firstly, the bottom of the pyramid was a concept that was seen to be, sort of a new kid on the block that has the potential to address poverty alleviation using a very different model. It did come out from the promise of the microfinance movement. And so if you read the first article, it tells you a summary of what exactly it is. And in practice, though, you will see that what happens is that, again, when we looked at Kintaro's examination of the Kerala project of those telecenters at that point in time, you see that, again, the concept itself and implementation can be difficult on a variety of factors, and we talked about what those are, not least of which is the tension and the philosophy between profit-making and a social mission. And in this day and time, there's still no best practices or no template yet about what can work. There's a lot of anecdotal stories. Then we talked about appropriate technology and innovation, another 2, new trends. And Heek's article has a lot to say about, the models of innovation. How do we work with the poor, for the poor, by the poor, and also what is appropriate technology, where he's suggesting that we're moving away from the infrastructure side of things. In the early days it was the last mile infrastructure, to move away from that into applications that can actually be used, user interface that is useful, and a whole host of other things like interactivity, etc. A lot of the things that the iSchool is actually teaching as part of its course. And then we talk about openness, being a concept that is sort of the new thing, right? Open development, it came from the open source technology, software development movement. And so you see that right at the forefront of it, there are a lot of these proponents saying, wow, this is it. This is how you get participation. This is how you get, things going. This is how you get transparency. And then in the article and also in a lot of the critiques about the concept, there is also some suggestions that it's not as good as it is set out to be. So again, you see these same trends, right? I mean, in academia, that's a swing. this really, really works. No. This is a critique. Oh, no. So that's what we talked about in our last class. And then I actually wanted to do an exercise with you, but we ran out of time. But I did get a couple of emails from some of you that says that it might be useful for you if we went through this really quickly, because it might be useful for your projects as you go about, either doing your class project or even implementation in in the real world. And this is what I'm seeing, right? So I basically randomly picked Christina's project simply because she was the first one to appear in class yesterday, actually next to Johnny, where we said, well, let's talk about this app, and this is a very kind of typical. You can slap a USAID logo on it or even a DFID logo that says, okay, right, now we have this particular type of project we want to focus on with a particular subgroup of a target group. And, we're into all this innovation fun and we want you to respond to our request for proposal, but you need to tell us how your project will integrate with these trends and buzzwords of today in ICTD. So one of the things they would, and in the proposal they would say, well, suggest the project activities and see how they correspond to these things. So I thought, well, why don't we use Christina's project? Let's discuss this for 15 minutes or so, and let's boom, see what does it look like in practice if you're actually drafting and subsequently implementing a proposal? How does this look like if you're trying to match your project with whatever trends that's floating around these days? And bear in mind these would change. So with that in mind, Christina, maybe you can give a quick 1 minute reminder again about your project, and then we can discuss as a class how to integrate these factors.
You might remember that I'm interested in impact sourcing, which is, there's a definition out there, but basically it's a way to do a lot of the internal data management of small or big corporations or companies or whatever entity, but instead of offshoring and outsourcing this to a competitive market, it is socially targeted to bottom of the pyramid, if you will. And so I'm looking at what different organizations are doing that are implementing this impact sourcing idea, and to come up with a recommendation for countrywide in sub-Saharan Africa.
Right. So basically what you're trying to do is you're trying to match, right, companies that have either data or digitization needs or any kind of lower level IT needs to a particular target population, which in your situation is the urban youth, the urban population, or you call that urban youth, that has a high proportion of women. Am I correct to frame it in this very simplistic way?
Sure.
Right? So you've seen, and you've seen things like Samasaurs and also Digital Divide Dividend, I think DDD, that does things like that, right? In Cambodia, they actually did this. A lot of the scannings that we have that Google has been doing or whatever Amazon has been doing is actually done by, this group called DDD, where they rented like a 7-story building and had these tons of paperwork, and all they do every day is just scan and scan and scan. So that's the type of project you're thinking of, Christina, and you're thinking of either an app or some kind of IT solution.
Not exactly, but maybe for the purpose of this exercise, sure.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, so let's then backtrack. Are you
What I'm doing is more research based. I'm looking at what different organizations are already doing, and then researching this information to come up with a recommendation of what potential approaches could work better. So it's not necessarily an app; it's more of a policy brief.
Okay, well, fair enough. So let's just say, okay, you're looking for a solution that bridges this. In all possibility, it might be an ICTD solution. It might be an adaptation of what has already worked, etc. So if we look at this project and we actually dump in these trends, right, and we say, well, okay, let's put in what are some of these elements. So in a project activity, right? And then we have policy, so how do you integrate the policy, how do you integrate your project or your with the country-wise policy? And then we're talking about, the bottom of the pyramid model. So, in practice, they will be saying things like, okay, it has to be sustainable, it has to be, you have to have a hybrid fee-for-service model together with a social mission. They might use different words like this instead of using bottom of the pyramid, but that's sort of what it means. And then let's look at the whole concept of innovation, right? Technology, right? When we talk about appropriate technology. And then this whole concept of openness. And open everything. So you can see that most RFPs leave it like that. They don't necessarily tell you how to do it. Okay, so let's brainstorm really quickly. What would that look like? What are some possible activities in any of these categories that you would build in? Big sigh. I hear you. I do. I feel like that too when I come across RFPs like that. I'm like, oh. Anything? Just throw in whatever. How would it look like in practice? If you were to design a project that has these, or in Christina's case, you might want to recommend to say, well, these are the trends that are out there, and this is what is considered best practice of implementation in ICTD projects.
Maybe like bottom of the code. Are you looking at policy specifically?
No, anything. Just throw it and I'll plug it in.
Bottom of the pyramid, maybe like find a local organization that you collaborate with.
Local organizations that you collaborate with?
Because you're not going to just randomly single out people in the streets to start, doing micro work for you. You have to find some sort of existing grassroots organization that aggregates that kind of talent.
Okay, so these people will aggregate it, right, for you, and then might there be any kind of a business model surrounding that, because it's supposed to be kind of addressing it using the bottom of the pyramid model, right, where you have fee for service. So you give them, what might some things look like? You give them a commission for every job that they get, or something like that? Maybe? Commission? Yeah, so, okay, so maybe a commission.
So they're kind of like micro recruiters?
Huh?
So they're micro headhunters?
yeah, exactly. Or like, the way that Elance does it. I don't know if you know Elance, right? You kind of get an overhead from every job, or a lot of these labor apps have different models. Okay, so work with local organizations to recruit for you, and then maybe give them a commission. Okay, that's a good project, plausible project activity that would address that. Anything else? Christina?
I think if this is at the policy level and working with the government, it would be important to look at the different legal frameworks that exist in the country to guarantee that there is a minimum wage, so it doesn't become exploited and just another outsourcing.
Okay, so like labor protection laws, right? And then the way that you would build it into activity, what might that look like? You hold, dialogues, right? So you call it, I hold dialogues with government, and then you can mention, okay, here are the 3 ministries I work with. You might be able to work, you might want to work with advocates, right? Say NGOs that actually promote fair labor laws, for example. You might look to see if, for example, international organizations like ILOs, do they, like ILO, International Labor Organization, do they have any so-called model laws, right? That you can say, okay, let's look at those, but then let's adapt that to the country. So then you go through what the article was suggesting about, you go through this whole consultative process, right? You help the advocates to implement, to advocate for a change in policy, and then you go through this 3 reiterations of getting public to come and comment, over 7 months, and then at the end of the day you get buy-in, and you hope that that gets passed, and you pray and keep your fingers crossed that nothing strange happens in the country, like the whole government collapses or they go into war. So that's a possibility for an activity. Anything else? Let's just plug in. What? Just throw in the kitchen sink. Because that's sort of sometimes what we do during brainstorming. It's like, well, what do we do in this country with policy?
Maybe you need to see for tech if what kind of tech people have access to and what is already what is already saturated in the market, and maybe use that.
Okay, so you're looking at technology, right? So basically do a market survey of sorts, right? Market survey or whatever, right? Of technology penetration.
Yeah, and maybe there is already existing government surveys or something that they have.
Right. So that would be. So basically, when you write a proposal, right, you would say, okay, this is activity 1, 2, 3, or whatever, and then this, if you call this activity 3, then 3.1 will be a sub-activity. So this is like, okay, you do your literature review, okay, academics, government statistics, census data, right, international rankings of penetration. You do, a whole bunch of maybe whatever is in academics, right? And then you could do a whole bunch of other things as well. You could actually do a survey if you wanted to, et cetera, however you want to do that. Okay, quick, let's keep going, and then once we plug in, we'll move into today's lecture proper. These are all very good, plausible activities. Yeah, and especially think about your own projects, right? So, hey, like how are you going to, if there's a requirement, if a donor says, okay, I'll give you, $2 million over 2 years, if you could plug all these things, if you could show me how Sahe can address all these things in your pilot geography, how would that look like?
Well, innovation is tough because that's really something unique, right? I mean, that's like the
Did you say innovation?
Yeah, the innovation part is tough for us to suggest things because that's like the crux of what makes them like unique. There's no like standard process for showing something that's innovative or having an innovative idea, right?
Right. Although if we adopt Hicks' approach, right, then you can say, okay, well, how do we innovate? Do we innovate the first phase of creating that platform with some feedback from them? And then at some point, at the second phase, we would do it a para-poor model or, sorry, Tim, go ahead.
Oh, I didn't interrupt you.
No.
But when it's innovation, the innovation of the idea or how it is to be implemented?
It's what is in the RFP, right? It's open to interpretation, and it all looks like that. Promote new innovation models and involve participation from your audience. And usually that's all it says. And then it has some cursory paragraphs about, what we think that means in literature. But then they would leave it up to the practitioners to actually fill in the gaps. So it
could be an idea that's not at all innovative, but their approach to like user acquisition or the way that they crafted like a niche strategy to launching the whole idea, that could be extremely innovative.
Yep, absolutely. So you could have a process, you're talking about a process, innovation of the process, right, as opposed to just the technology. So you introduce an innovative project process. And what would that look like? What would that look like?
it could be like identifying people from you know, local communities we think we particularly good
Yep.
at performing the type of micro work that they're
Right, so you look for your leaders, from community leaders, right? And they might, sit in an advisory group, or they might be part of your project group or whatever. Yeah, that's a good way to do it. Anything else to add on any of these?
I think for innovation, you also need to look at the competitive landscape. And so you look at community, you look at your competition, you look at what your users are already doing.
Mm-hmm.
And like
For
you said,
innovation, right?
yeah. And like you said, you probably include one of those HEEX processes, or whether you want to do participatory design with the user, so you either do
Right.
Pro or Para or one of those things and go ahead with that. So, but you could, there's definitely scope for doing participatory design. So doing, developing the MVP of sorts and then testing it with your users. And maybe even giving it to them for free and then taking it back, seeing whether they really, really want it or use it. So
Okay, yeah.
that would be counted as innovation too.
Right. So repeat that activity again. So
The activity would be participatory design. So doing user testing and continuously evolving your product.
Okay. Participatory design. Right, and this is a great point, and I want to also mention the competitive landscape, right? A lot of the times your competitive landscape is also your partnership landscape. So you can go to country X and you say, well, who's actually doing what? Oh, USAID has actually funded this innovation lab, and within this innovation lab, right, someone is doing something similar. Okay, can we partner with them, and what exactly are they doing? Good point. Okay, one or two more points, and then let's move on. Mm-hmm.
So you were saying the reason why we're doing this plotting exercise is because donors often require this.
Mm-hmm.
So they say we have these buzzwords and we want you to explain how your project.
They don't quite say, yeah.
But I wonder, maybe this is not for now, maybe you could just share an actual proposal, because the proposals you shared with us were really generic.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe you could share an actual proposal with that, because I've never seen that done in a proposal before for ICT4D. So I think that would be really useful to understand what is the actual language used and.
Yeah, I certainly can, and I think especially even some of the DIL brands language is very much like that, right? So obviously what I'm doing is I'm dumping a lot of the buzzwords. In any of these proposals, there might be one or two or more of what's happening. So yeah, I'll find some proposals for you, but I'm pretty sure that even in the USAID, let me see if I can find it. Even in the USAID, okay, see, revealing demand for pro-poor innovations, right? So you're talking about pro-poor. Are they right? Is this your? Yeah, this is DIL. So what does this mean? See, for technology to benefit those at the base of the economic pyramid. So even in this one thing, you already have, some kind of pro-poor, model with innovations. You talked about, for technology to benefit those at the base of the economic pyramid. You talked about bottom of the pyramid. How much are they willing to pay? So it's another kind of model, right? And then, and then if you read, I'm sure the DIL request for applications, and I'll plug it out for you, but this is sort of what I mean, when you see that right now a lot of these sound like that. 10 years ago it would be, okay, you would need to do this and you would need to show how the last mile folks benefit, right? What kind of infrastructure are you going to use to make sure that X number of people actually have access? They might be talking about digital divide. How do you show that after your project, the digital divide is less, right? So that's probably the type of proposals that's 10 years ago. These days it's kind of like that. So when you write a proposal, you're not going to do it like this, right? You're not going to say, well, this is how you do policy. You build into your proposal, you would say, okay, whatever it is, like the goal and then the sub goals. And we would talk a lot about this when we actually talk about proposal writing. So you have, your goal is 1, 2, 3, right? And then your sub goals is 1.1, 1.2, 1.3. And then you would actually talk about your activities. And this is how you plunk your activities into your main proposal, and then you address this. So when they actually look at okay, how, because they do give scores. So they would say, so in your narrative, you would say, okay, you know, we will be working with government officials from the Ministry of Labor to do A, B, and C, and this addresses the RFP's, need for policy. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, but it'll be interesting. I'll plow through this. Eric?
Well, just to fill in the last one, or I was just suggesting, like, could this be part of the process as well in openness? So you could maybe hire like a local NGO or like that deals with the labor.
So you're suggesting
organization to like do like measurement and evaluation of your project, so they're kind of like giving oversight.
How does that relate to openness, i.e.?
Because it's giving transparency into your process. It's,
Okay, so local NGOs, that makes sense. If we look at openness in terms of that, right? And then you would see. So let me very quickly give you some usual things that people talk about, right? Policy is always like that. Dialogues go through a round of discussions, have everybody be on the. I'm sorry, Sheila?
For the bottom pyramid thing, having a plan for reaching out your target audience, will that count as an activity or?
It could. You just have to link it to the bottom of the pyramid. So maybe what you can do is to say, well, you do a market needs assessment, right, based on maybe the capacity or willingness to pay, right? So you're looking for price points. What are you willing to pay? And then at the end of the day, you come up with some kind of a budget that balances. Yeah. But yeah, so the bottom of the pyramid, a lot of people will suggest, okay, we will we will have partnerships between the local entrepreneurs, like umbrella organizations, together with the umbrella NGOs, and then through that, what they would do is they would create the app together. A lot of it is like that within an innovative lab that is already existing in the country, and through a participatory design process, right? And then with tech, a lot of the times it's typically a market survey of tech penetration is really good to do, because in this day and time, a lot of people just zoom in and they say, okay, we're just going to do mobile and we'll do smartphones, and we'll do, I've seen people do like Apple apps, except that Apple is not at all penetrating that much in developing countries. And in terms of openness, a lot of times they would say, okay, we will let developers do this open source, and we would actually get developers from the local country to do the development of the app, so that it can be maintained, for example. So these are just some of the permutations and combinations. Does that make sense? So I want us to get out from the actual activities itself to just kind of see how, in practice, you might, when you look at trends that are happening, and then you understand, okay, why is this RFP talking about things like this? And what you're trying to do is to basically go onto the wave with them and say, yes, I'm addressing these things that you are concerned about. Does that make sense? Any questions on this before we move on? Right, so this might or might not be useful for your projects, but if you wanted to get funding, that's one of the ways to go. Really just look at what your donors are concerned about and then just dump it to them in heavy dose. Okay, so what I want to do, so no questions on this, right? Let's move on to today's lecture first. Let's talk about Eric Brewer's article. Did you get a chance to read that? Actually, it's a fairly interesting read, and it brought me back really like traumatic PTSD type of memories. When we were trying to implement projects, because all the things that he talked about are so real. I remember firsthand, and I hate geckos. I know, and people tell me geckos are so cute, but for whatever reasons, I just hate geckos. And in our Asia projects, I do not know why. I thought geckos were cold-blooded, but somehow they like to hide near the fans. Maybe that's why it keeps them cool inside the computer towers. So very frequently, they would get so close to the fan that it would jam the fan. And so, everything overheats. they get disintegrated or whatever, and then everything stops working. You are in a rural area, maybe about 800 miles away from the nearest city. You kind of put the thing into a tuk-tuk or a van, and you go rickety, 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 rickety. By the time you get there, things are even more in disarray. You go there and you say, oh, look, I need a new fan. And they're like, what brand are you using? Oh, we don't carry this in this country. We don't use Lenovo. So very, very typical things that he's talking about. So I want to hear from you guys. I mean, like, what are some of the things in your own experiences, right, in terms of infrastructure and implementation of your e-applications? What are some of those things that you've run into that he might or might not have talked about? Right, and if you look at his framework, it's fairly simple. He's talking about the software, right? The software. Oh, well, actually, he talked about hardware and equipment, right? And then he talked about the software, and then he talked about what we might call the context that he calls wow, I can't spell today. And do you know who Eric Brewer is? The person who wrote this article. You want to share with your colleagues, Priya?
Yeah. So he's the head of the peer group here at UC Berkeley. It's called Technology and Internet for Emerging Regions. And most of his work is, it's usually hardware-based work, like mostly like setting up base stations and.
Mm-hmm. His engineering. His background is in engineering.
Yeah, his background is in engineering. He's a professor in the East department, and most of his projects are more hardware-based, like base stations or low-cost sort of video conferencing tools for.
Yeah, cool.
Like the projects
that he's talked about, right? Very hardware-based. And if you look at the researchers that work with him, those are some of them are our iSchool graduates. We have one from urban planning, Jogajit and Melissa. I think they've all graduated and gone on to do good things. So yeah, what is in your experience or what he has said? What are some of those things that are the usual differences in implementing in a developing country versus here? Eric?
Well, I have so many problems, but
I know, when I read it, it's like, whoa, the PTSD coming
well, I
back.
can combine the hardware and environment. So there's these PCs that have been sitting for 6 months in the second wettest place on Earth. And so although they were protected from rain, the moisture affected all the electronics. And then you're having to travel 3 hours to barter in a different language parts that don't necessarily fit. And then the software, viruses and things for horrible, but there are solutions for getting around stuff that are nice, but you have to have the knowledge to be able to do that. And so passing on that knowledge and making sure that people respect documentation, like a lot of things are just done by word of mouth. And so we're talking about technical things to get people to adopt that culture.
Right, culture, management, right? Capacity of the local people, right? Those are some of the things he mentioned. Yeah.
And then we would do an assessment of schools based on how well they could secure the PCs, and thought really good about ourselves. Well, then we got robbed in our place where the PCs were actually
left.
Yeah, maintaining them before we delivered them.
So many things, right? Yeah, I know. I read this and I go, whoa, you're bringing me back too. Anything else to add? Yeah, he mentioned a lot of really, really relevant things. CD?
I haven't done project, but just from my exposure to the different projects that were going on in Home, I found that sometimes you always have a person, I'll say, inside the company who is, let's just say, hired to oversee the whole process, and then when something breaks, they take the initiative to just dismantle it and do a quick fix on something, and then quick fix leads to another quick fix, and then the whole thing just gets destroyed.
Right. Well, this is part of the culture, right? The quick fix. Actually, this is really interesting too. That every time I go to a country, like when I was in Uganda, they have this thing called monkey. Is it monkey fix or something? When there was something wrong with the car, and this was not ICT per se, and I would be like, okay, let's just go and get the parts. And like, no, I know this guy who knows this guy who could do this, and so. And honestly, a lot of times I don't even know what they do. It works and might work for 3 weeks to 3 months, and then it breaks again. Yeah. So yeah, quick fix, which is part of the culture, which is actually it's a beautiful culture to me, because it's about surviving and doing things in a way that is like, okay, I have very little resources, let me see what I can do. I appreciate it, but I can see the pitfalls.
I would say in environment there's also like corruption and bureaucracy.
Okay, yeah.
Widely different across different countries. And
Yep,
sometimes you have to
corruption.
incorporate them in your own structure to get work done.
Mm-hmm. So what have you seen this in your own experiences?
I've seen it in India.
Yep.
I haven't implemented a project there.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, like I was actually part of this group that teaches underprivileged children, and to get access to, so they were just teaching English and computers. So even to get access to schools and talk to the principal, you have to kind of bribe the gatekeeper.
Right.
So you would say, I want to talk to the principal, and then he'll never let you in. And even though you like talk to the principal beforehand, he'll still ask for money. And sometimes you just have to give that money to them. To just keep them happy, even though you have a letter from the principal allowing you to go, and he'll be like, "Sir, I don't have any money. Like, can you just like, I know you're coming from an affluent background."
Right. Absolutely. I mean, it's very frustrating for us that really wants to do the right things. Having said that, a lot of times it also means you have enough money and enough connections. You could probably do anything in that particular context that you can't do in a regular bureaucracy. But yeah, that's extremely frustrating. Anything else? What about, hardware, software, right? We talked about humidity. I think Eric mentioned a little bit about temperature as well.
I think electricity, and he talks about this a little bit, and the lack of generators is often an issue.
Right, electricity, electricity that is both of quantity, i.e., do I have enough of it, and also quality, right? Because what it means is that, well, I might have electricity, but I don't have enough for 15 minutes, and then it just drives things bad.
For the software, actually, there's a lot of times where the software is so outdated, and it's frustrating. Like something as basic as Microsoft Word, I found a lot of companies are still on the 2003 version. They're doing processes that take so much time. At 2010, you would just do this way. So
right, yeah. And this is also tied into your capacity side of things, right? And in the article, you mentioned something that I've seen it too. Every time there's a problem, right, you cannot find your file, or I think that I have a virus because this pop-up still keeps popping up. What do the vendors do? They reboot the entire thing, so they spend like hours and hours and hours just kind of reformatting the entire hard drive and then reinstalling the operating system. That's what they were saying too. The operating systems. There's multiple levels of the operating systems that they're talking about. In the article, things like, okay, if you use Linux, for example, it is a very solid operating system, but you don't have capacity to fix it. If you use Microsoft, that's where you get a whole bunch of viruses, and then every time there's a virus, people would just wipe everything out and reboot everything, spend about half a day doing that, and then they would lose their antivirus software anyway.
Yeah, and I think another thing tied to the viruses is the fact that some of these applications and software are expensive, or even if they weren't expensive, the fact that people have to pay money for them, they don't like to do that. So I know it's worth it when, if anybody has let's just say Microsoft Word, or even just something as simple as VLC, you have it on one flash and it's going through 50 people all the way down.
Yeah.
So it just, the virus is, that flash is a virus.
Right.
So I think it's tied to finances in a way.
Yeah, the flash drives and then the sharing, and not to mention, your flash drives get stolen too. At some point, it's gone, and then it's wiped out.
It's more to do about the environment part, where the focus is still making the processes manually work instead of automating them, and they kind of keep doing the work again, same work again and again, especially data entry stuff. most of the processes that I have seen, they're like very manual.
Right, yeah, so, reinventing the wheels, right? Reinventing the wheels of things that have already been done. And also inefficient processes. Like exactly like this, right? Something's wrong with the operating system. Well, something is wrong with the computer. Instead of trying to figure out and pinpoint what it is, it's like, okay, let me just replace the whole thing. Anything else to add? Hardware, software, environment, even from your own experience.
Yes, there's a lot of dust and pollution as well.
Mm-hmm. Dust and pollution.
So not just in the context of these projects, like even I have personally experienced a lot of issues with lint getting into the fans of my laptops, and I've already replaced my fans like twice in my laptop just because of the of dust getting accumulated there.
I know, it's funny, every time I go to Africa, when I come back, my hard drive just starts spinning slower because I think there's accumulation of dust. As a result of which, sometimes I just kind of wrap the whole thing with saran wrap, but I don't know. I think we discount how real this is. Yeah, anything else to add?
I had to add to Ruchita's point. It's a very valid point about people wanting to keep the manual labor in.
Mm-hmm.
It's also because they don't want to throw people out of jobs, because it's to maintain the whole community setting where you don't throw people out of their jobs, and you always want to maintain relationships.
Right.
So there's so much of social capital built into professional relationships that you wouldn't want to eliminate people just by automating something.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you have people still like manually, just one person recording everybody's attendance, even though you could easily do that to an Excel file. So many jobs and many people are not, many jobs are not getting automated.
Yeah, and there's no incentive really to automate it because the skills are actually low-level skills. We always joke, every time I go to like a developing country and you go past a stretch of road that needs to be fixed, you'll see like this whole bunch of construction workers, right? Like maybe 20 of them. And you're wondering what are they doing? They're sitting around chatting. And we always say, well, how many people does it take to actually just pave the road? So most of the time, they're just, and it's true, it's part of that culture, for good or bad. Yeah. What are some of the other things that he's talked about?
Training and retention of like higher management.
Yep. I think that we, capacity, right? So training, and you're talking about people that in some cases that are illiterate, right? And that they try to use the voice software, and even that didn't work, etc. Yeah. So, okay, one or two more points, and then let's move on. And the takeaway is this, right? As you think about this, as we're introducing whatever you're doing, right? Health, education, agriculture, even governance and law, for example. Even if you have an e-government kiosk in a rural village, you run into all these problems. And even in the capital, a lot of these things happen as well, and sometimes especially at the capital. Yeah. So just get this. Keep it at the back of your mind as, you go into practice or you design your projects. And that's why, there's a lot of emphasis right now. If you're interested in hardware, I think Invenio, which is based, and also Equal Access, these are two organizations that are based in San Francisco that actually work on hardware issues, where they try to build hardware that withstands all these issues. Okay, any other last words to add? Tim?
Yeah,
or questions?
Interfaces, software.
Sorry?
User interfaces.
Tell me a little bit more about the user interfaces.
Just that when you design software to be used, actually, in America also, but just like people who aren't particularly familiar with computers, you have to be very careful about your design and make sure that it's actually usable.
Mm-hmm.
So they could be like, it actually can take years to get a community who doesn't have adequate exposure to computers to be able to use software to design.
Right. Yeah, and that's also a huge issue. Sometimes it's also language. It's user design, it's also language where there's no, we've seen people memorize, like I've seen people who are actually the proprietors, they can't really read English, but then they would memorize, like, okay, I know if I needed to print, it's the fourth one down from file, and then that's what they do, in addition to user interface problems that have cultural issues. Okay, awesome. So again, this is, e-applications, especially in rural areas. So we're talking about infrastructure and rural development, which is one of the first subsets. Okay, now let's move on to telecenters and the short article that I assigned, right? This is sort of, again, it's the buzzword. Like I said, when I first joined, telecenters was like, wow, the thing. And the telecenter movement was touted as the movement that would grant access that would then allow people to open markets and things like that. So the whole notion was, access, right? And then the conceptual background behind it was like, okay, there's a digital divide, right? There's inequality, there's inefficient markets. So the notion is, well, as long as we give people access, right, through telecenters. Right, so we give people access, how do we do it? We do it through telecenters, right? And then that would solve all these problems. That's the thinking behind it. And so obviously that didn't happen 10, 15 years down the road. So what's happening now? What's the new kind of tweak model according to that article?
Mm-hmm. I'm trying to understand more when I'm reading about these telecenters, and I've seen different setups at home, and I'm wondering what actually falls into. So you have the call centers, and you actually have, it's not just a public phone, it's like a streamline of telephones, where they call them telecenters, but basically where you can make calls and make the call centers where people are looking for a company addressing issues, and then you have the internet cafes where people are doing a lot of activities. What's the range? What falls into the category and what doesn't?
That's a good question. I mean, when they're talking about telecenters, they are talking about internet cafes, right? And within the internet cafes, well, there are usually no call centers, but sometimes in the internet cafes there will be phones, and then there'll be other subsidiary services. So it is basically, if you think about it, you go in, you just see a whole line of, it's like a computer lab at most. Yeah, and we've seen that everywhere, right? Most of the time they are done by proprietors. Sometimes they're NGO-based. And these are the things that, when we go visit and we're tourists, we actually go in, and that's where we actually try to send out emails and things like that. Yeah. Okay, so what is the new concept right now? What has changed? Why are telecenters morphing into some other concepts? So basically in the article, and in practice, this is what happens. The telecenter it's believed that it's a simplistic belief, right? That's the whole issue about the debates. It's too simple a model. You give people access and then all these things will be solved. Because a lot of what is not done is, there's a lot of things like, okay, what about content? Right? I mean, so what if you give a whole bunch of, say, new generation Cambodians who can't read English access to the internet? How many Cambodian, Khmer, which is the local language, how many of those websites are those? When we were implemented the project, there were only 26 websites, out of which the majority of them were donor websites. So there was no content, right? And then the other thing was that you're not necessarily responding to their needs. A lot of the times when people come in, they actually want certain things. They want training. They want the network effect. They want to look for jobs, etc. But there's no resources that actually grants them that. There needs to be some kind of intermediary that facilitates this particular issue, right? So what has that morphed into? Right, in the article and in today's terms, the telecenters have sort of become, what they call, shared access resources, shared access labs, right? And the advocacy of this is that, it should be a part of like a community structure, like libraries. And any sense where this trend came from? It's weird. It actually came from Microsoft. They actually did a lot of local library projects in the US that seemed to be fairly successful. They were targeting the rural population in the US, and what they did was they put computers in there. A lot of people in industry are skeptical about the motivation behind the process, saying that, oh, it's just Microsoft trying to gain advantage, right? Because if you give this new generation of folks Microsoft operating system, then you get them using it and you get them hooked on the projects. Regardless of that, somehow the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation had a lot of success in the American projects that they did in the libraries. So what they're doing now is replicating this model globally. So what happens is that you see, shared access labs, or sometimes they're called, innovation labs, that coexist within the libraries of the local entities. And then if you look at what some researchers are even actually doing, as part of research, is they talk about, well, how do you design these labs so that you promote the best use and you promote people networking and innovating. And that it becomes an entire science and art in that whole process. I mean, there are actually people who do this for a living. How do you actually design a particular space to promote these kinds of things? Yeah. So that's all I want to say about the telecenter movement. But I invite you to ask questions. That blog article is just an interesting read. He was talking about how telecenters are no longer sort of the buzzword, and then now these innovation labs, shared access libraries, those are sort of the new trends. Any questions or feedback on that, CD? I'm sorry, did you?
No, I'm trying to find a way to probably relate this. I feel like what's really lacking is having, I'll just use my country as an example, small country Swaziland, having the Swazi companies and organizations actually put up all the information that I would need on the website. Or even let's just say job search.
Mm-hmm.
If I was applying for a job in Swaziland, I'm not going to go to any website. Like, they'll put their careers tab there, but it doesn't work. They either don't check it, or it just, there's this huge gap between, the user using the internet to access these companies, but the companies are not really meeting the user.
You mean, you're talking about job search?
Yeah, I'm just using job search in particular. I feel like there's this huge gap with data that is at least applicable to specific countries. I mean, in the US, if I Google anything, I'll find it. But if I'm trying to find information about anything, so I think if it's just job search, it's hardly ever there.
Yeah, I mean, and that's that's a trend in a lot of the countries that is common for a variety of reasons. First, I think it's the culture, right? At some point, I remember people saying, well, I don't need the internet to look for a movie, I can just call the movie theater, or I can look at the newspaper, right? I mean, once upon a time, it was that kind of a culture. And then now today, it's like, what telephone hotline, It's you go to Google and it tells you where the movies, and it's in a way that is useful, and then that's where adoption starts happening. So I think one is a cultural thing. Another thing too is that in developing countries, the restriction of information is actually creates power. So there is a lot of incentive by certain groups. I don't know if companies and jobs might be one of them, but certainly there's a lot of incentive for organizations not to share information or create information. So you see even the best websites in developing countries are just a storefront mostly, especially government website. There's no back end. There's no here's how much each of us earn, which is amazing to me. I mean, put into Google and you can see, how much your senator earns and things like that, which you cannot find in other countries because there's no incentive to break open that Pandora's box.
So going by the Heeks paper, this would be more like ICTD 1.0 still, right? Because there's where's the element of first scalability, like financial sustainability and stuff like that? And I mean, it's still not really using the technology that is in people's hands, or sort of, people still have to go to these internet cafes go up to find these libraries and share access labs and sort of use it then, but it's still...
Yeah, it's still not that kind of innovation that Hicks envisioned, right? Where you're talking about, wow, this group of local people that are actually coming together, they're creating these apps, they're actually building, local brand hardware that is feasible, and they're putting it in places that make sense to them. I mean, sometimes it could just be the town hall building, or sometimes it could be, where you read the advertisements, where, where normal rural people, they don't necessarily go to the library to read the advertisement. They go to the town hall place, the marketplace, where there's all these posters, right? I mean, that might be an appropriate place. But so you're right. I mean, like, this is sort of moving, but I guess it's not that kind of thing that Hicks is proposing we should do. Not to say that I think Hicks is the guru or whatever, but it's not that kind of innovation. So yes, and it's still very conservative. It's a conservative model. I mean, at the very most, even USAID has started these innovation labs, RFPs, where they say, okay, now instead of telecenters, I want you to write me a proposal as to how to create innovation within the country, but the parameters are still fairly conservative. It's like, oh, we don't really want a high failure rate. We want you to do things that are, that promotes the marketplace and things like that. Yeah. So you're right. I mean, it's not that progressive, but I don't know. Yeah. Any other things about telecenters? Yeah, and a lot of people have also criticized it for ousting out budding entrepreneurs that could be operating an internet cafe, because there's no price point for competition, because the NGOs are fully very much highly subsidized. Yep. Any other things about telecenters? Okay, so just get this sense, right? That telecenters have become this shared library, whatever, which is yet one kind of more common type of e-applications to bridge the digital gap. Okay, now let's move on to that article. Okay, wow, I would admit I could not read that article in detail. And I've been assigned this article 3 times in the iSchool. Did you attempt? I mean, and the reason why I can't is simply because I'm not interested from an economics angle, nor am I capable from a mathematical whatever. I understand the concept, but what is your sense? I mean, I'm guessing you at least touched on it. This is the article that has been touted as, wow, this is the classic case that economists, and because the economists have done it, and they've done this fantastic control groups and all these tests, that means it must be true, right? Because it has been monitored and evaluated. And then in my Jenna Burrell and a couple of other researchers, I think, have recently published, I think it's still in publication, an article actually criticizing that, but that's why it's a sign. It's sort of the classic, wow, this really works, and we have this, methodology, so you cannot argue with us. So with that context in mind, right, let's look a little bit at what happened, and let's, if you want to know the methodology, I probably is not the best person to ask. But let's take a look at what happened, before and after. And if I were in this, in this country, you would have the before, diet photos. Although in over there, it would be the opposite. It's like, wow, the more well-fed you are, the better it is. So what happened on a variety of levels? The prices, right, of fish, that's one. Okay, another one is the number of markets. So basically he did the whole methodology, if you stand back and look at what is he actually doing? They have put in a lot of measurements and methodologies to make sure that most of these changes are actually related to the cell phone, the prevalence of cell phone. Okay, and then he talked about waste, right, and inefficiencies. And he's also talked about profits, and then an extrapolated to welfare, right? And then he touched a little bit on the concept of sustainability. So what I'm reading from the article, and feel free to tell me I'm wrong, which is very likely, is it seems, so the story that I'm hearing is, okay, before the introduction of cell phones, life was bad. Okay, and after the introduction of cell phones, life has become pretty good. And because we did this measurement in such a clinically clean environment, i.e. with our methodologies, we can more or less safely extrapolate this and generalize it to conclude that ICTs given to fishermen or farmers in rural agriculture is a good thing. Okay, that's what I'm reading. Anybody can tell me otherwise. Very simplistically, that's what I'm... No, you disagree?
No, I agree. I think that's basically what he's talking about. You're talking from a fundamental economic theory perspective, where we talk of, when you talk of economies and markets, we talk of what you call the general equilibrium theory, where a market is like perfect.
The perfect information.
Perfect information. There's no externalities, there's no government.
No barriers to entry, etc.
So I think like that's what he's talking about. How people were, because they were able to use the cell phone to communicate.
Right. So before mobile and then after mobile, right? So basically what he's saying is, well, all these factors lead to, less barriers, whatever econ terms they are, right? So what he's less barriers, more competition, all the econ terms that then brings you closer to a perfect market. Right? That's kind of what he's saying. He's not saying it is a perfect market, but he's saying, before it was like that, after it was like that. So what are some of the things he's found? What happened before? What was happening before with pricing of the fish? Did you read the... Yeah, what happened before with the pricing of the fish?
Yeah, there was like very fine...
Fluctuations, right? Fluctuating prices. Right, and what was the reason for that? That if you think about rural folks or agriculture folks, why would the prices of the fish fluctuate? Christina?
So full disclosure, my background is in economics, and
is it economics?
Yeah.
Oh boy, yeah, maybe you should.
And newspapers can be like a big deal in the field of economics. So
it is a big deal, right?
I'm biased a little bit as well, I think.
Towards it.
Towards being more sympathetic with this approach. I think you were saying before life sucked and then life.
I know, I was exaggerating, yeah, but.
I think the main issue that he discusses is the lack of information and how that led to all of these bad outcomes on all those sides.
Right.
So even with the fluctuating prices, it came down to this lack of market information. So fishermen wouldn't know how much. How many buyers there were, what price they were willing to pay, how much fish to catch.
Right, because if you think about fishing, right, like a lot of agricultural things, time is of the essence. They're on the boat and they need to sell the fish. There's no refrigeration usually. So there's no time for you to send people out and go to the market. So you just basically make a best guesstimate and go, okay, here's the local market, I'm just going to do it there. But there's no information about where the demand and supply is. So at another market, there might be not enough supply, but you wouldn't know that. And therefore, that drives the prices up. And if you're back in your local markets where the supply is too high, you drive the prices down. Right? That explains that. What about the number of markets that they're talking about before the mobile? Access to the number of markets that they end up going or knowing. Right? It's a related point to what Christina was saying. That if you're on the boat, there's no you don't know what are the prices in each of the markets. You don't really know where, you don't even know if there are new markets coming up, right? So what he's saying is that, there's just one, local market. So most of the time, what they do is that after they get the fish, they dock, they take the fish and they just go back to the same old market and then rely on what are the market conditions there. So, and then what did he say about these wastes and inefficiencies, about, throwing away things and things like that?
Well, I'm trying to remember this like a year ago, but wasn't there something about like they didn't know which fish they would catch that day? Because, in that region they might catch one type of fish or whatever, and so you could cause like a surplus in a certain market that would be an inefficiency that would lead to waste because they weren't taking it to a market that
needs that, right? So maybe type of fish, right? And essentially it's very much linked to, again, your supply and demand and your market. That what happens is that a lot of fish just gets thrown away, and so there's this waste, and it's not an efficient market because the supply frequently is more than demand. So so they get thrown away. Okay, and then if profits, let's just say this is the baseline, right? This is what they make right now, and this is also the baseline. So this is what they make now. Okay, then what happened when they say, well, after the mobile, their methodology was they measured 3 different villages, and they kind of tried to separate all other they tried to separate all the other factors that might intervene with these particular factors. What happened with the prices that they found?
consumer prices went down.
Yep, the prices went down. And if I'm not mistaken, it was also more stable. Right? I think it says it went down by 6% or something like that. There was less fluctuation.
Yeah, surplus. Yeah.
Right? And then in terms of the waste, there's more surplus, i.e. that I guess that means, and Christina, correct me if I'm wrong, that means each family is consuming more fish. Am I right? Because there's is that what he's saying?
Yeah, he's saying that prices converge because there were villages and local markets that sold at very low prices.
Mm-hmm.
So rather than just going down, they stabilized at a midpoint. And the waste was, and families would consume more. Right,
and families was consuming more. So he said, okay, families consumed more, right? And he linked this, and then families consume more fish in general, and then the fishermen, the income increased by X percent. 8%? Okay. Yeah, and then what about markets? What happened to what they were able to do with the markets after they had the mobile phone? Sorry?
Did it help them know where to sell the fish?
Yeah, they know. So they know about the markets. Well, I guess they know about the market conditions of each local market, so they can actually try to meet it, right? Another point I think that was made was also that the type of fish that was thrown away was that because of the mobile phone, they were able to they were able to fish optimally, which means, they called their friends or their friends said, hey, this is where we have this kind of fish, and that's what is needed. Come here, and then everybody fished there. So that's anything to add about this, and then where it fits into what we're talking about is that we're talking about the intervention using an ICTD technology with people that are in the rural areas and particularly in agriculture. So that's where, you know, things fit in, and there is this kind of, I don't know, Christina, share with us, what is the sense in the econ side of things? Like, this is touted as what, like a good study, or?
Well, I think it's an early study in the kind of experimental RCT field. So there's some things that you address, but you try to generalize towards perishable and non-perishable markets, and it's a bit, you know, as we can see with Jenna's paper later on, you can just move a little bit further away and find that the results don't hold.
Right.
So I think economists, you know, realize some of the weaknesses of this paper.
Mm-hmm. Well, it has been critiqued, but at the end of the day, you know, that this is sort of what the real world is like, right? Even when we evaluate any kind of project, even if we come to the conclusion a project worked or a project not work, and this is probably one of the more vigorous methods of monitoring and evaluation. And you would see that when we do monitoring and evaluation, that this, you know, when we go into sophisticated M&E type things, that, you know, in the industry, it's considered usually sound. So what happened was that then there was a lot of mobile intervention, you know, after this, and then the whole mobile movement was promoted too. Yeah, anything else to add before we call it a day? Or any questions about?
Actually, was there supposed to be a link to Jenna's paper?
Sorry?
Was there supposed to be a link to Jenna's rebuttal?
I think it hasn't actually been published yet.
Okay.
Yeah, but what I do have is, you know, sort of a synopsis, and I'm actually going to see her. So what I'll do is I'll ask her to send me her last draft at least, and see if we can. I mean, I'm sure we can share it with you.
There's a draft
But
online.
sorry?
There's a draft online as well.
Oh, is that a draft online? Awesome. Okay, I'll link that. So, you know, this is sort of the synopsis that it's written. So basically, it's just a critique. And what she's saying is what Christina was saying, you know, well, this is a pretty good study, pretty comprehensive, but can we really generalize it that much? And then bear in mind Jenna's background too, which is in ethnography, you know, more of the softer social science side of things. Yeah.
Well, I didn't know if she mentioned this, but I thought one of the ones I remember being interesting was there's a lot of talk about the inequities that are created when you introduce certain technologies by the capacity of people to adopt them or afford them. And he mentions that there's these spillover effects that even if you couldn't use a mobile phone, that other fisheries or fishermen are benefiting from the efficiencies in the market that result.
Mm-hmm. And if you think about that, that's very similar to our kinds of development debates that we talked about, right? Which is very econ based. Oh, you know, things will trickle down as long as there's, you know, increase in income, it will affect everybody else. So yeah, in his paper, he did mention that, you know, it seems like only the fishermen that were richer, right? The what he calls fishermen with the bigger boats are the ones that that have the highest penetration in the mobile phones. But, well, you know, whatever, we think that spills over somehow because, actually, I don't know what's his argument, but, you know, it does spill over somehow. And that's a very typical economist way of thinking. Even, you know, in the modernization theories we were talking about, you know, neoliberalism, it's always the, oh yeah, you know, it will, the benefits will trickle down. Yeah. Christina, you look like you want to say something. Please do. No, absolutely. Please contradict me.
What he was saying was that the richer fishermen that have the mobile phone will then, you know, go to a different market where there's still a lot of demand.
Mm-hmm.
And the smaller boats will maybe continue to go to the same market, but now there aren't the big fishermen that, you know, so the surplus is not as much basically.
Right.
So that's like the trickle down effect. It's more tangible than just somehow it's going to trickle down.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah.
Yeah. And he also made a case about, well, on sustainability, well, we'll talk about sustainability, but what he was talking about is the fish, there's income increase, and then he extrapolated it to equate it to welfare of sorts, right? That, well, if you have more income, your welfare is increased. But then, of course, he acknowledged that, well, we didn't really measure that. We can just assume that this goes back to the family and the welfare has increased. Cool. Okay, any last words on ICTD and mobiles and the things that we've talked about, trends and the three related subsectors of rural connectivity, telecenters, and agriculture? No? Okay, cool. So